All right, Larry. Well, thanks. We finally made it here live. Sorry to all of you with the Facebook Live. We're still learning about how to use Facebook Live, and we weren't able to get Larry and myself on at the same time. But I know there's just a lot of interest in this concept of agency, and not just the concept, but how we use it clinically in NARM. And I just would really love to hear from you about how you hold this concept of agency, and then when you're working with unresolved developmental trauma, how do you start bringing that in to help support clients in addressing their unresolved trauma?
As a preface, I'd like to create a bigger context in terms of the NARM context, that this third pillar, as we call it in NARM, of agency comes into play. And this is a really important piece and a distinction between many other psychotherapeutic models, because in NARM, we hold that it's not what happened in the past, excuse me, what happened in the past that is what drives the symptoms that people have. It's the way that our relationship to the self and to the world has been distorted through what happened in the past. And that makes it a different model, and that's where agency starts to come in, and I'll get more specific in a moment. But this piece that it's like, we develop these distorted identifications. We develop distorted relationships, what are traditionally called object relations. We also get profound physiological dysregulation as part of the adaptation to trauma. And so in NARM, first we work in the here and now, because all of these distortions, all of these adaptations that people have made to be able to survive in whatever family environment that they had come into play and are addressable in the here and now in that moment. And this is where agency comes into play, because you see, when you're working with reductionistic models, which say you're this way because that happened to you, or you're this way because of neurotransmitters, or you're this way because of such and such, it just as I was mentioning, it's reductionistic, and it takes in a certain sense, it creates a sense of helplessness, that how are we going to deal with these things if it's all about what happened in the past? But the distortions in the relationship to self and other is immediately addressable. And in that process, that's where agency comes into play. Because what that means is that we see ourselves not just as victims, but because of course many of us as children were victims, but as adults, we can start to see more and more of the part that we play in whatever emotional dynamics are going on in our life that are causing us pain or suffering or difficulty. And it's the opposite of blame. When people blame themselves, that's not agency. That's the opposite of agency. When people purely blame others, I mean, there are certain circumstances, of course, when even as adults we can be victims. But in general, when you're talking about like regular relationships where there's just emotional challenges and problems, is that we need to see our part of whatever the dynamics are. And that's where agency comes in. So for example, if a couple comes in and their intent and they're holding the position of just blaming each other for everything that's going wrong in the relationship, they're not experiencing any agency. They're seeing themselves as the victim of their partner. And when they do that, or when that's what's going on in the relationship, that's not a good prognosis for the couple. Conversely, or contrary to that, is that as the individuals in a couple start to own and see their part in whatever emotional dynamics are going on, that leads to increasing sense of agency, increasing or a lesser sense of being the victim of your partner, and it's ultimately liberating. And so, there have been other models like Gestalt therapy, and they use the word responsibility, for example, but I avoided that because it brings in the element of blame. And there's no blame in this, but there is in adults the reality that, we carry forward, as I heard Brad say. It was frustrating because I couldn't join in, but as I heard Brad say, talk about the environmental failure and how we carry that environmental failure forward, and how we continue to reenact that with ourselves and our relationships with other people. We either act in or we act out or some combination. So
Well, and Larry, even more than that, I mean, I think clinically, so many of us, you know, with our really challenging clients, it almost seems like part of them at least doesn't want to improve, doesn't want to get better, no matter how much great work we're doing with them. And I think this speaks to it a little bit. The investment, at least part of us are invested in not having agency and not moving into our adult capacities. And I think that is something that we bump up against a lot, even when we're doing really effective work, until we start to bring online the psychobiological connection to agency. Then I think we can easily get back caught with our clients and stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure the clinicians watching this see that all the time. And to some degree, it's true for everybody, but it's certainly more true for some people than for others, and how they're kind of invested in seeing themselves in a certain way. Now, I'm just talking about in emotional kinds of difficulties as the victim of their partner. I'm not talking about physical and sexual abuse or those kinds of things at this moment. But just in terms of that, again, as I pointed out a minute ago, that creates more of a sense of being an adult, more a sense of, personal kind of accountability, but that word has kind of negative connotations, and personal responsibility, again, without any kind of blame or judgment.
Yeah, I guess for what I've heard from so many clients, and I've experienced myself, is that there's two sides to it. There's both the fear on some level of not being who we thought we were, and having those kind of identifications. And then on the other side, I think that's so much of what we are orienting to, that there's another side on the other side of this. What happens if we're able to really move some of these obstacles out of our way and really show up in the way that we really dream about or wish for ourselves? Mm-hmm. But the point of the agency, which I think is so critical, is so many, even our adult clients, see their obstacles on the outside. Mm-hmm. And there are real obstacles on the outside, but so much of what's in our way of really connecting deeper to ourselves and our own capacity is these obstacles, like you were saying, that we developed inside.
Mm-hmm. And really, it's those internal obstacles that are addressed when we're addressing NARM, that it's never rarely just about the situation. Again, now I'm just talking about in normal emotional relational difficulties, not extreme situations at this point. But so that's a very good point that you're making, Brad.
So anything else as we just kind of wrap up that you think people might be interested in terms of agency? And
well, there's just a couple of reflexive things, like in terms of the languaging, we use reflexive forms so that we see that what our part is in something. And we also avoid using nouns, for example. So one instance of this is burnout. In NARM, people will come in and they say they're suffering from burnout as if that was something that just happened external to them. And with the right tact and timing, we begin to rephrase that and reframe that is how they burn themselves out. And what we always find is that whatever external pressures there were, and there can be many real and valid external pressures, but still that internally the person stopped listening to their body, stopped listening to their emotions, were intent on doing it perfectly or driving themselves in some way. And so ultimately they get to see that it isn't just something that they experienced in the workplace, it's something that they were also doing to themselves. And that actually, rather than blaming, when it's done in the right frame of mind, it's freeing, because then they say, oh, I have been doing that. I can start to listen to myself more. I can start to pay attention to my emotions. I can pay attention to my body. I can, I don't have to drive myself and try and do everything perfectly or be everything to everyone. So that's a very important kind of practical piece of this.
Okay. And so for people that are just kind of wanting to start to, even just after this 10-minute little video, start to bring some of this idea of agency into their clinical practice, anything that they can look out for, or any kind of tips for how they can start to bring that into their clinical orientation?
Well, there's not really so many just like simple tips, but it's there's a certain kind of space that the therapist can hold, which is always not just addressing things on the surface level, but asking themselves, what is going on in my client here that they have stayed in this relationship that, let's say, is unsatisfying for so many years? So we begin to invite a reflective inquiry into that dynamic. And we see that, for example, sometimes people will feel they don't deserve better. And they got that distorted identification very early on in childhood, but they're carrying it forward into the present moment. And so to think more in terms of present tense and less, as many therapists do, thinking about all the answers are going to be found in the past. So that's a simple tip as I can do in the short period that we have here.
Oh, that's great. And I think a lot of us really love that about NARM, that we can work really in the present moment with people's, you've joked and I joke sometimes that we don't need to regress our clients. They're coming in regress because they're showing up with these.
It's not really a joke. It's true.
Yeah. No, but you're right. Because they are. It's like we're all showing up. When we fight with our partners about the dishes, it's like that's not, that's our child consciousness that are fighting there between the dishes. We don't need to regress ourselves back to that. We're already there. And the idea is, how do we bring ourselves, at least one foot back into the adult consciousness? And I think agency is really that bridge that does that.
Just a very useful awareness tip for people watching is to really look at those areas where you pretty regularly get triggered, either in personal relationships or work relationships or whatever it might be, and then begin to inquire into what is going on with me, and not just looking at what's going on outside of you. What am I doing with this information, whatever the information is? That starts to then build agency into the therapeutic dynamic.
That's great. All right. Well, we'll figure out how to do Facebook Live, and we'll continue to do some more.
Next time will be better.
All right. Thanks, Larry.
Thanks, Brad.